ngikhala kanye nani ngikhalela isizwe umsebenzi umntwana awenzile ngingasasho umsebenzi wasedlunkulu nje kuphela nokumele iqiniso kwaze kwaba kusekugcineni.
AmaZulu King has cancelled the reed dance. Mourners continue to arrive at Kwaphindangene, the home of IFP President Emeritus Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, to pay their respects. The African National Congress has until tomorrow to hand over its national cadre deployment records to the Democratic Alliance. Very good afternoon. We're coming to you live from our studios here in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you for tuning in. You're watching The Week Ahead. You can interact with us on social media platforms. It's at Week Ahead, and our hashtag is The Week Ahead. I'm your host, Mfundo Mabalana. AmaZulu King Misuzulu Kazwelithini has cancelled day 2 of the traditional reed dance. Now this is following Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi's death earlier yesterday. Misuzulu was speaking on opening day of the annual ceremony. This was at Nyongeni Royal Palace in KwaNongoma. The somber event was dominated by the news of the passing of the Zulu traditional prime minister at his Kwaphindangene homestead in the morning. Misuzulu observed the proceedings with an unoccupied chair on his right-hand side to mark the fall of the nation's prime minister. All right, now for the latest on what's happening in KwaZulu-Natal on the following day after the death of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Let's cross to our reporter now, Simphiwe Makanya, who's at Kwaphindangene Royal Residence in Mahlabathini. Simphiwe, good afternoon. We understand AmaZulu King Misuzulu Kazwelithini cancelled day 2 of the traditional reed dance. How has this news been received there?
Indeed, Mfundo, well, since yesterday, people have been flocking at the Kwaphindangene residence here in Ulundi to send their condolences and offer words of comfort following the passing on of Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi yesterday in the early hours of yesterday. And as I speak to you, we are joined by Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who is an ANC NEC member, who also during his tenure as the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal. Kapazala, thank you so much for your time. Your reflections on the life of Prince Buthelezi.
Well, I think our first members and the Buthelezi clan, which he was head, and of course Indlunkulu KwaZulu for the role that he has played as a father and a pillar of the AmaZulu as a nation. And of course, the people of South Africa has been one of the very important leaders over the history of South Africa. I think it's important that when we are here as ANC, our reflection is that beyond the flags, different party political, different political contestation, we have people, we have leaders, we have people who will mean something to our people, who are trusted by our people. At the end, we have to respect them. We are here to pay tribute to Prince Buthelezi as the man, a leader, and someone who has really shaped quite a lot of political discourse in South Africa. His contribution is such that if you look at the history of South Africa for the past 30-40 years, you would actually not be complete without placing in context his role, as it were. So we are here as the African National Congress to pay tribute to the man who has led in this country. And of course, we have a very interesting history in that Prince Buthelezi started as a member of the African National Congress, and his attachment to the African National Congress has been legendary. He is known to have I'm ANC, and at some point he would even tell us, what do you know about ANC? And this for us tells us that there's a lot that we've shared with Prince Buthelezi. So we are here to honor his legacy as amongst the traditional leaders in this area. He's been one of the most senior, and that all the younger traditional leaders looked up to understand the role of traditional leadership, the challenges and the history and so on. But the royal house as well, he has not only been part of the history, he was actually a participant in that history. So there are instances where when you want to know what happened, 3 generations ago, he will not give you the history, he will give you practical experience, having at the center of all of this. This was the value that he brought into all of this. And of course, over the period, whether he's a member of the ANC or IFP or whatever party, there are lessons that we actually can draw out of the man. And one of those has been his level of humility to relate to people across different parties. Actually, at a certain point, transcend party political differences and relate as a human being. And as we're sharing, experiences of jokes sometimes and so on. But also quite a powerful debater. When you have to deal with issues with him, you would do research, unimaginable memory, or remember facts and documents and so on. So we actually, legacy of an administration, yes, that was working, and we actually found things that we to build on. The current financial institutions such as Itala, we actually built on it. It was some of his legacy. The schools and some of the programs of community development, we actually have taken those forward. So I must say, there's been a lot that has been in common, even though there were these issues at the political level. I think the major sadness is around his wish for reconciliation, which he had reached in between himself and this is a legacy that I build on all of us, and then make sure that between ANC and IFP there's true and complete and final reconciliation, because they're actually not meant to be 2 different parties. It was supposed to be the internal wing of the ANC once it was in exile, and one doing something from exile, the other one doing something from inside the country about this to face each other at a certain point, and I was in those where some of the old leaders, CJ Mteto, Prince GL Sulu.
All right, those are live visuals there from Gwapindangene. That's my colleague Simpuya Makanya. Unfortunately, that line isn't so clear. We'll try and re-establish that line. But he was in conversation there, as you would have seen, with Dr. Zweli Mkhize. A very important message there that we perhaps need to place into context Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi's contribution to the broader politics of South Africa as we continue to unpack his legacy. We must certainly be getting a number of speakers, one in particular being Dr. Shongwe, to further unpack this gigantic political figure, towering figure that is very complex and multi-layered when we speak of his legacy. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. The G20 leaders have adopted a joint declaration despite concerns heading into the summit that disagreements over the war in Ukraine would derail chances of that. The declaration focuses extensively on the world's economic problems, especially those faced by developing nations in the Southern Hemisphere. To that effect, the G20 grouping also inducted the African Union, a move that the host India says will amplify the voice of the Global South. Ishan Garg has more from New Delhi.
Here at the G20 summit, one more member has been added to the group. The African Union has been formally inducted under India's presidency. It's a development that comes after months of negotiations.
India had promised that the African Union will be given a spot in the G20. I believe this proposal will be agreed upon by everyone here. With all of you agreeing upon this decision, I would like to invite the chairperson of the African Union as a member of the G20.
BRICS members India and South Africa have been pushing for the AU's inclusion for some time. Inclusion in the G20 gives the AU the ability to influence key decisions related to solving the economic problems of developing nations in Africa, making the global economy more equitable and increasing representation for emerging economies was at the top of India's G20 agenda. And the leaders' declaration reflects that.
No document of G20 has had such an immense focus on developing and emerging markets and the voice of the global South as this particular document has. This is a document of the global South. This is a document of the developing countries which came together and spelled out their priority.
The final document asserts the G20 nations' commitment to expanding funding for developing nations. It also stresses the importance of sustainable development and says the G20 nations are committed to stepping up to solve the global crisis that is climate change. But it's actually the paragraph on the crisis in Ukraine which led to fierce negotiations between delegates. The joint communique notes that the war in Ukraine has plunged the world into an economic and food crisis. But the language doesn't include a strong condemnation of the war, which most but not all members agreed to in the declaration after last year's G20 in Bali. This year's communique says that G20 is not a platform to address geopolitical crises, but one that should focus on the economic problems of the day. Getting the members to agree on a joint statement is being hailed as a massive win by India, and many say that it also reflects India's growing diplomatic clout worldwide. Ishan Garg, SABC News, New Delhi.
The National Assembly has delayed voting on the appointment of Koleka Kalega as Public Protector by 10 days and will only consider a motion to remove suspended Public Protector Advocate Buthelezi Mkhwebane from office on the 11th of September. The Assembly's Programming Committee had initially called for a sitting of all 400 MPs to debate and vote on the recommendation of the Section 194 inquiry that Mkhwebane be removed from office and also to consider Kalega's nomination as her successor on the same date. Parliament then decided on the roll call voting system for each of the motions, which requires each MP to answer yes or no when called. Joining us now is legal analyst Ridumezi Benedict Piri, MD of Jurisprudential Specialist Council. Benedict, as always, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. So tomorrow brings to finality this unprecedented process to remove a head of a Chapter 9 institution from the adoption of the rules that we saw back in 2019 to all of the litigation. But now the vote is going ahead. Just your views on all that we've witnessed pertaining to this matter.
Yeah, I think it is remarkable and it is unprecedented what we've witnessed because we've really seen Section 194 of the Constitution in action. As you indicated initially, Parliament had to adopt rules to give effect to the Section 194 process, specifically the work of the committee to recommend the impeachment of the head of a Chapter 9 institution. And what is left now, because we did see initially that there were allegations of misconduct against Buthelezi Mkhwebane, which is really the thresholds within which the head of a Chapter 9 institution may be. We saw that be removed, and what is left now is for Parliament to adopt that recommendation, and after that, the President give effect.
Benedict, there was the secret ballot request. It has since been rejected. It was brought by ATM as well as UDM. The Speaker stating that there's no threat to any individual or some sort of a prevailing toxic environment in Parliament. What did you make of just that decision to reject that request?
And, you know, the ATM are probably one of the parties that are most with respect to these ballots. Speaker does have a right with respect to the secret ballot, and I thought that she are in line of the other reasons that we have seen where secret has been refused, and certainly I think even in that context it would be difficult for the ATM to challenge the decision of the Speaker in this respect, which I think she's well entitled to take.
Now, still on the ATM, on a number of occasions, they've highlighted, among others, the fact that this process has been unfair towards the Public Protector, but they've also spoken of the clean audits, the timeous completion of reports, that such instances should perhaps assist in coming up with a more fair decision or outcome in her favor? Can such be viewed in isolation, though? Or you could have an instance where one, or in this case, 4 cases, can actually alter your career if, in fact, your interpretation of the law is so flawed?
Yeah, absolutely. It cannot be viewed in isolation. I think it is important when you look at the requirements as to what is required for the appointment of a public protector, which I think is Section 183. One of them is that it must be a fit and proper person who's actually qualified in the law. And if you have a public protector who, in this particular instance, there were court decisions that basically questioned her ability to apply the law, and more importantly, got it so wrong that it looks like she actually was pandering to certain interests. I think that is grounds for. And having said that, the outgoing public protector was afforded an extensive hearing into her misconduct, which found the same way. And then the third step is obviously Parliament. So I don't think that the ATM, what they have to say, is actually correct in this particular instance. I think the whole system is designed for fairness and is designed to ensure that when you do remove the public protector from office, you've actually engaged a very thorough process and the grounds for removal are actually correct, which is what we have seen in this particular case.
Mm-hmm. Can you place it for us into context here for those that might not necessarily be aware of the processes or the sort of support that is at the disposal of a public protector? Can they ever so often, when they are seized with a particular case, actually seek legal counsel here to say, we need a legal opinion as to whether we can actually continue with this case? Do they have a budget for such, where they would then solicit the advice of a legal practitioner practicing one?
Yes. So the public protector, as you would have seen, does get involved in litigation every now and so often. And for that reason, external legal professionals are solicited. But as we've seen, even in the context of the public protector inquiry that we've seen, the Section 194 inquiry, we've seen that in a number of instances, the Office of the Public Protector does solicit advice from external legal counsel with respect to some of its work and support. And for a number of reasons, being sometimes they just don't have the manpower to get through that work. And where that is the case, as we've seen in this particular inquiry specifically, funds are made available for the work of the Public Protector's Office within the prescripts of the budget. So that is something that absolutely occurs, yes.
Perhaps to refine that question, Benedict, I'm purely speaking on just the ability to get an opinion before you start with an investigation. For instance, the CIX report, that somebody else would go through this and say, based on what is before you, you don't even need to pursue this. Would they be able to seek legal counsel beforehand? Just an opinion whether we should pursue this matter, even with the Ivan Pillay matter, which related to him now being allowed to cash his pension fund, and then he was brought in back as a consultant. Just those particular issues at the very beginning before you pursue the matter. Would she be able to seek legal counsel and get some sort of an opinion as to whether it's something that they should be pursuing?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is always available to the Office of the Public Protector, together with a host of a number of other powers, including the ability to interview witnesses, subpoena, take statements, etc., and call for evidence, etc., that she could actually utilize to form a preliminary opinion as to whether a matter should be investigated further or not. So that is one of the avenues or the tools that the public protector can utilize to, appraise herself or satisfy herself as to whether a matter should continue with an into the investigation stage and further and so forth.
And then last week or earlier this week, we saw the public protector, Busiwe Mkhwebane, insisting that she, in fact, can now return to office because the matter, or at least the aspects that pertain to the Section 194 committee, had been concluded. What did you make of that whole debacle where now the president had to come out and say, no, in fact, it hasn't concluded. The last aspect will be the vote, and then it will be concluded?
Yeah, that was completely unnecessary from the outgoing public protector, because I don't think on any sense of the interpretation of that presidential minute or the effect of the suspension and what it was intended to do, you could come to the interpretation that she held. I think it's very clear that the work with respect to her removal from office is ongoing until we get that parliamentary recommendation or non-recommendation tomorrow, and then only after then, assuming that the recommendations of the Section 194 committee would not be approved by Parliament, then we should be able to go to office. So I think the President was entirely correct in his interpretation of the matter, that the matter will actually finalize once Parliament adopts its resolution on the 11th.
Do you think it made matters worse for her if there were those that were still on the fence about perhaps how she acquitted herself through her tenure? Because I saw a statement by Glenys Breitenbach that this very incident now, this very decision, proves to them why they need to vote against her, because her interpretation of the law is extremely flawed, according to them. Do you think she made things worse?
I think it definitely played into her detractors, because, even on the stretch of the law, that interpretation would have been a very difficult one to hold. And certainly on a simple logical basis, that interpretation could never be given effect to. So certainly her adopting that position publicly and in that manner, I think certainly played into the hands of her detractors, such as Advocate Glenys Breitenbach, who would say that it has been confirmed that she's not a fit and proper person to hold the office of the Public Protector's Office, and the work of the committee, or rather Parliament, should to give effect to the recommendation of the committee.
Now, looking at the numbers in Parliament now, there's a strong likelihood that they will vote to remove her. What avenues does she have beyond that point? Because one would assume that she would challenge whatever outcome.
In the absence of a challenge to the recommendation of the Section 194 committee, I believe that Advocate Mkhwebane's chances of challenging a resolution of Parliament would be very limited. I think she has to try and attack first the recommendations of the Section 194 committee. Could succeed on assuming resolution holds. But we know that, insofar as Busisiwe Mkhwebane's removal is concerned, a number of political parties are in favor of that, the ANC, DA, and IFP and Freedom Front, plus amongst others, right? So that one is expected to go ahead without much of an issue from the reports that we're hearing. And certainly once that resolution is adopted by Parliament, there will be very limited recourse for Advocate Mkhwebane in setting that back. I think what she would need to do is firstly attack the work of the committee,
which she has indicated she will.
Yes.
Apologies for interjecting, but she has indicated that she will be challenging that particular recommendation. Now, the big question becomes, can the outcome of tomorrow be suspended by her filing of her papers, where now she says suspend the implementation of that outcome, because the implementation means she's removed automatically and then she will not be able to get the 10 million gratuity. Would that process be suspended? Can she have two applications to say, I want to challenge the recommendation by the Section 194 Inquiry Committee, and then beyond that, I want to suspend the outcome of the vote for tomorrow, so that nothing is effected, nothing is implemented, and I remain a suspended public protector who would still be entitled to her gratuity come October the 14th?
I would say if she brings an application after the parliamentary resolution has been adopted, certainly the horse would have bolted in that particular respect. And I think she wouldn't have any chances of halting the implementation of that resolution pending any further legal proceedings. If she has to bring legal proceedings, and if she wants to, I would say that literally she has to do it before that resolution is adopted tomorrow. And she'd need to do two things. She'd need to firstly basically bring a review application in respect of the 194 committee's recommendations. And then secondly, she'd need to interdict the vote in Parliament. And I think in both respects, or at least interdict pending the outcome of her review application. And I don't think she would have strong enough grounds for the basis of an interdict, just given what you started with at the beginning of this interview, the enormous history of this matter and her conduct that has been actually under scrutiny the whole way.
Benedict, as always, thank you very much for your time. That's Ritumezi Benedict Piri, MD of Youth Prudential Specialist Council. More news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us. Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, the Democratic Alliance's Federal Council leader, that's Helen Zille, will lead the party's national delegation, where the North Gauteng High Court proceedings will hear the party's seminal case against NERSA's national electricity tariff hike. Joining us at this moment is Ms. Zille herself. Good afternoon, Ms. Zille. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, I remember vividly how the announcement of that 18.65% landed on citizens who were barely surviving in this economy. So legal challenges were honestly expected, and yours will now be heard. And you maintain specifically that NERSA's decision constitutes an irrational, unreasonable, retrogressive measure. Talk to us about this.
Yes, indeed. There are two parts to our court case, but the one has to do with NERSA. And our argument with NERSA is that they failed to take all the data into account when the multi-year price determination was put in place. There's quite a complex formula. There are two stages. The multi-year price determination is when public participation takes place. That did not happen, and therefore space was not made for a crucial cross-subsidy to help poorer consumers. And we believe that is a fundamental misinterpretation of Section 15(1)(e) of the Electricity Regulation Act.
But you also go on to state that even just their reasoning is so flawed, because here it's premised on the idea that increasing the tariff would assist with Eskom's financial woes, but you're of the view that it wouldn't. The administrative issues have nothing to do with money.
Absolutely. Now, that comes with our first particular stage of this case. We are wanting a declaratory order from the court that declares that the government's duty was to prevent an electricity crisis, which fundamentally undermines constitutional rights in many areas. It not only failed to prevent it, but it actually caused the problem and exacerbated the problem. And it's for this reason that we say that any amount of money is not going to help Eskom recover. That is why we're asking for a court to appoint a special master, which is a provision that allows an expert to be put in charge of monitoring, evaluating, and reporting on the actions of a government department at any level. And we want this because we don't believe that Eskom is capable of doing this. So we want special master to be appointed by the court to try and ensure that the Energy Action Plan, the EAP, is properly implemented.
Now, your particular founding affidavit was filed in January, and quite a lot has happened since then, particularly the appointment of an electricity minister in March. So one does still need to ask that, are you still of the view that government's response to the load shedding or electricity crisis is still inadequate, even after perhaps that appointment of the electricity minister and the subsequent lowering of stages, even though now, particularly this week, they went up to stage 6?
Well, I think that answers your question. Minister Ramaphosa did say that, in fact, he was on top of it. He had a plan. They were implementing that plan. And he even said that that plan was the reason that load shedding stages had come down. Now, of course, he's now had to eat his words, because a whole number of power stations went down simultaneously, unexpectedly. And we don't believe that the appointment of Minister Ramaphosa is going to make any difference. And we don't believe there's the competence, the capability, or the oversight to ensure that Eskom can make the recovery it has to. We would like the court to appoint a specialist who has a specific duty to report to the court on what is being done.
So this matter, as it's set down just for one day, it will be heard throughout the course of the week?
Yes, indeed. There are different aspects to this. And the judges have asked for the different aspects of the case to be separated from each other. So they have a whole elaborate timetable throughout the week in which this case will be heard.
And quite a number of government departments have been cited, as well as premiers. So it's most certainly a very complex case. Ms. Zille, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Good luck to you and your party. That's the Democratic Alliance's Helen Zille speaking to us. More news on the other side. Stay with us. Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, the Democratic Alliance says the ANC has until tomorrow to hand over all its correspondence and records from its deployment committee unless the governing party approaches the Constitutional Court. Now, this after the Supreme Court of Appeal rejected the ANC's attempt to appeal against a court victory for the DA over the practice of cadre deployment. The Supreme Court of Appeal ruled on Monday that the ANC could not appeal against an earlier loss in the High Court on the matter. The ANC had approached the appellate court in the hope of overturning a February 2023 ruling in the Johannesburg High Court, which directed the ANC to provide the DA with its internal records pertaining to cadre deployment within 5 court days. To discuss this further is political analyst from UNISA, Professor Dirk Kotze. Professor, good afternoon and thank you very much for your time. Firstly, your reaction to the SCA's dismissal of the ANC's attempt to appeal that High Court ruling.
Well, it therefore confirms, obviously, the High Court's opinion. And I think this is also an indication that it's actually the second court case. The first one was about the documents with respect to the period between 2018 and 2020. And there the ANC also lost this case. So it's consistent with that first judgment. And therefore it became quite predictable. And I think this one will therefore follow suit.
Which is, they are now requesting from 2013. But when listening to their arguments earlier this year, that's the African National Congress, they had sought to elevate the fact that not all their preferred candidates had been successfully placed into certain positions. What were your views on just that argument as some sort of proof that theirs remains almost like a wish list? It doesn't necessarily mean that they impose their wishes on government officials.
Well, I think the crux of the matter for me is the fact that the ANC is not just any political party. It is the governing party. So therefore, whatever their decisions are carries much more weight than that of, let's say, the opposition parties. And if they have a dedicated committee like the cadre deployment committee or the political committee in Parliament, specifically to look at that, then it becomes something of public interest. It's not a private matter anymore, as the ANC to a large extent argued in this respect. And I think whether it is that whether their preferences become the final decision is not necessarily the main issue. The main issue is that they have this influence that I've now mentioned, and it plays therefore, it carries a lot of weight in the process of appointments, which are supposed to be prescribed legislative or constitutional processes in which political parties can't have a say of their own. It is part of a public process. And I think the fact that these meetings were not taken in public, that is the complication that exists.
Now, they have constantly then pointed the finger at the Democratic Alliance, who are in government in the Western Cape, and said, we believe in as much as you haven't given it a name, you also do use that particular policy. It's not unique to the African National Congress. You would still look within your political party when it's time to deploy into government.
Well, the argument in principle is correct, and that applies to all over the world. And that is then when political parties or governing parties become involved in this process, as I said, it becomes part of the public interest. And therefore, it should be available to the public. I think what is the argument about the ANC, they have formalized it in the form of this political committee of the ANC. It's chaired by the deputy president. And therefore, it has become more formalized than what most other governing parties are doing, where they can have these discussions, but it is not in such a systematic and formal way as which the ANC did it. So for the ANC to get past this point is just to dissolve this committee, and still they can continue with it as other governing parties are doing that.
But can they honestly afford to do this? Because if we look at the political machinery of the ANC, that here, if we look at cadre deployment, in most instances, many have accused them that it would never be that they would want to bring in the technocrats, but would mostly want to deploy those who have been strong mobilizers within the political party, some say, even as some sort of a reward. So would they want to perhaps dissolve such a structured committee, which would bring them names even from lower structures of individuals that they're not necessarily familiar with, but that they would have been told that at provincial level, this particular individual has been mobilizing for the party and perhaps they are suited and could be placed in this particular position? Can they afford to actually do away with this sort of structure of cadre deployment?
Well, what I'm actually mentioning is the formality about it. The practice of it will never be able to stop. Because it happens all over the world with governing parties that they discuss who are the people that they want to see there. I think what we've seen, and the Zondo Commission made obviously a very strong pronouncement on it, even called it unconstitutional, is that it interferes with the level playing field that candidates are supposed to have when they are applying for senior positions. And there can be preferences from the different parties. We've seen it, for example, in the parliamentary processes where political parties have preferences when members of, for example, the electoral committee must be interviewed or appointed, or new judges, or now the public protector. That is so, but it is the final decision is a public decision. And I think the main suspicion is that if that decision in effect has already been taken before the public process has unfolded, that complicates the matter. That makes it that it is not what is the intention of, let's say, the constitution or legislation, that it must be an open process and the best person ultimately must be appointed.
Now, Prof, when observing this particular debate in the public domain, there are those who hold the same view as you, that it's not unique to the African National Congress. But theirs is that the ANC has placed itself in hot water because of the kind of candidates they then deployed into government. Do you think that really what is at the heart of this is the ill-equipped or unqualified candidates that perhaps were at times deployed into government?
Yes, that's certainly the point. And I think this is the main objection to this, is the fact that it enables this to happen without the public knowledge again. And it shields these candidates against better candidates who can therefore effectively compete against them. And I think this is the main point, is that it does not allow, there's not enough open space, open competition for the good candidates to have a chance against them. I'm not arguing that political consideration should never be there. This is a political domain. It is within the political sphere. The political considerations will always be part of this. And there will be persons who will be, because they of the political associations, will carry more weight. But then it is seen that how that is the weight up against the other considerations. If it is mainly or primarily or only about their political associations, I think that is where the problem comes in.
Well, certainly there would be a problem, as we have seen. Professor, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. That's political analyst from UNISA, Professor Dirk Kotze. And that's where we leave it for today. We're back next week. Enjoy your afternoon further.